Welcome to another episode of Health Creators. This is Liv, and joining me today is Jenny Barnett, CEO of Monument Therapeutics, bringing precision medicine to neuroscience drug development. So Jenny, historically, most drugs that touch the brain are known as dirty drugs because they have this non-specific receptor activation. So what is Monument doing differently?
It's a very good question. So I think the why most drugs have been dirty drugs historically is because we didn't have a really good understanding of the brain. You know, the brain's really complicated. We can't access it directly. We can't go in and take samples in the way that we can for most other disease areas. And what that's meant is that although psychiatric drugs have been around for a while, they've typically been developed by accident or by happy coincidence. So they weren't being designed specifically because of knowledge of what's wrong in the brain in a particular disorder, and therefore what you might want to do to remediate that. They were, happening upon, so things like lithium were invented because we were trying to improve some other disease, and we noticed that people's mood improved as a result of taking lithium. So over the last 10, 20 something years, we've kind of learned much more about the brain, and that's enabled us to get better at trying to develop drugs rationally and trying to develop an understanding of what's going wrong in the brain of people during a psychiatric or neurological symptom, and therefore what a drug might do to remediate that. So that's kind of one thing that I think the field is doing differently. And then at Monument, we're particularly interested in finding drugs or developing drugs that treat a particular subgroup of patients. So if we think about something like depression, there are drugs that treat depression. They're very commonly used, SSRIs, for example, but those drugs are quite non-specific in their effects. And if you go to your doctor and you get prescribed an SSRI, you've got something like a 1/3 chance that it will improve your symptoms, but maybe a 1/3 chance that it'll worsen them or you'll get bad side effects. And, 1/3 of people, it won't do anything at all. So what we're trying to do at Monument really is find those subgroups of people up front that we think have something in common in their brain, and then find a drug that we know acts on that common abnormality, put together a biomarker that detects the patients and a drug that treats those patients, and develop those in parallel as we move towards clinical trials.
Interesting. So it's almost like looking at groups that are treatment resistant for existing standards of care, and then like taking those specific groups and developing medications for them.
Yeah, that would be one way that you could go about doing it. We're actually looking particularly in areas where there aren't any standards of care. So we have a program designed to treat cognitive impairment in schizophrenia, for example, which is a huge problem. So about 1% of people have schizophrenia. Most of those can be treated reasonably well with respect to their hallucinations and delusions. So kind of these really strong symptoms that get you a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But then most of those people, even when the drugs are keeping those symptoms under control, are having real problems with things like memory, attention, planning, decision-making. So much so that, you might not be able to finish an education or hold down a job or hold down relationships.
As a result of the medication you have to take?
Not necessarily as a result of the medication, probably as part of the disease, actually. But lots of people have tried to develop drugs for this, and what we've seen typically is that in the early stages of clinical trials, these drugs look like they're going to work. And then in the late stages of trials where you work with big populations, you find, what looks like a good drug seems to still be helping some people, but not all the people. Some other people are getting bad side effects from it, or even it's worsening their cognitive function. So the way that we're approaching this is we're trying to find a biomarker. We have found a biomarker that we think tells us for a particular mechanism of action whether someone is going to benefit or get worse. So the vision here is kind of, ultimately, if we bring these things to market, your doctor's going to be able to say, okay, we've got a drug that might work. Now let's do a test and test whether we think it's going to work for you. So we do a a digital test. It takes a few minutes. Maybe we do it on your mobile phone or on the doctor's computer, and he can say, right, Liv, I think this drug's got a good chance of helping you. Let's give it a try. So that's where we'd like to move to in general with psychiatry and neurology, I guess, is moving away from trial and error prescribing, which of all the antidepressants should your doctor give you first, to something that gives some ability to predict what an individual patient is going to benefit from.
And do you think that's a genetics? Is there a genetics component to that now, or you're mainly looking at digital biomarkers?
So we're looking at digital biomarkers. I think there is a genetics component. We know that most psychiatric diseases have a strong heritable component, but it's complicated. So there isn't a single gene that controls risk for any of the common psychiatric disorders. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of genes that are influencing your risk, and that's probably because the brain's really complicated, and there's loads of ways that there's loads of things that can go wrong and cause a similar set of symptoms. So it would be really nice if we had genetic markers, because I think a blood test is something that people understand. There's a lot of stigma in many psychiatric disorders still. So if you could test someone and know for sure that they've got this diagnosis, I think it would, in some circumstances, it would provide comfort. But that's not, that doesn't seem to be how the science works. So instead, we're looking to kind of do something more objective than what goes on in the moment in a doctor's office, which would be like, how are you feeling, Liv? On a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? How's your mood been over the past 6 months since I saw you last? And that's a really hard thing to, to remember and to be objective about, particularly if you're suffering from symptoms. So we're trying to do something better than that, both as a way of making sure we're finding the right patients, and as a way ultimately of being able to say whether a particular drug is helping someone or not.
Interesting. So there's like 3 components of this, like you're diagnosing in a way, and then you're stratifying different types of patients. And then how does the drug development side work?
So we're working with existing drugs in the first instance. So taking drugs that have been approved and been on market for things unrelated to their brain uses. The reason for that, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is you can access these drugs and they're available, and you can, do early stage experimentation. They're really well understood in terms of their safety. So if you can use a drug that's already been used by hundreds and thousands of people, you're pretty sure that it's going to be, that it's going to be safe. So one of the major reasons why your drug might fail is taken out of the picture. And also because there's loads of really good drugs out there that we know from academic research, or again, that sort of happy circumstance that people have reported, actually this drug that was developed for something completely different seems to have a good effect on the brain. Can we use that? So the process that we're doing is basically matching drugs with known effect on the brain with patient populations where remediating that particular brain process might really help the patient. So it's about kind of a matching procedure.
And then is the next step to develop your own medications after that?
That would be great. Actually, one thing I'd be really interested in is we know that big pharma companies have tons of drugs sitting on the shelves. So drugs that they've developed to a certain point, and then either it didn't look so useful for the condition that they were interested in, or maybe their commercial priorities changed, or whatever, their competitor brought out a drug first. So when we started Monument, our idea was, could we get some of those drugs off the shelves and back into development for a CNS condition. Actually, it's quite hard to get drugs out of pharmaceutical companies. There aren't so many incentives for them to do that, which is why we started with generics. But I think you're quite right. It would be great to do this with new drugs as well as old ones. There's certainly loads of unmet medical need in terms of loads of conditions that need some new ways of trying to treat them.
Yeah, I wonder if you can buy phase 3 assets that never went to market.
Absolutely, you can. yeah, you might need deep pockets, but yeah, it's certainly been done a few times, yeah.
So is that the primary path you think Monument will go down in terms of the drug development side?
Yeah, we are a drug development company. We're ultimately doing what a lot of small companies do, which is trying to do a clever bit of science early on to prove that a particular drug it has got potential, and then the most likely ending for all those stories is that you end up licensing that to a big pharma company or working with a big pharmaceutical company for those phase 3 trials that are, huge and expensive, and big pharmaceutical companies know how to do that. Know how to do that part really well. So yeah, in many ways we're following a really standard biotech kind of path. I guess the bit that's a bit different is that we're simultaneously developing the diagnostic piece, the biomarker piece alongside the drug. And the idea here is that they'll end up in market together. So either it will be a drug with a companion diagnostic. So in the same way that, cancer treatment has improved so much once we learned that we should develop cancer drugs with a genetic test that told you whether your cancer was likely to be amenable to that drug or not. So, so there's that kind of approach, or just for subgroups of patients. So there's an approach where the drug will come to market and it'll say, for people with this disorder who are biomarker positive on, our particular digital biomarkers. So we think that's going to be an inherent part of it, both because we need that added boost to kind of get over the hump of efficacy that has often been the problem in clinical trials. So this problem of working for some of the patients, or maybe even most of the patients, but not all of them. Yeah. And because ultimately we'd like it to be the case that if you need a new treatment for depression, your doctor has some idea which of those drugs to give you first, so that you don't have to go through the trial and error that you were mentioning earlier.
And how did Monument get started? What was the kind of idea behind this, or why specifically this company? Yeah.
We were really lucky. So I was previously leading the scientific team in a company called Cambridge Cognition, which is a Cambridge-based company, Cambridge, UK. It's really a software company that develops ways of measuring brain function non-invasively. So things that look like computer games, but that are measuring specific cognitive processes or emotional assessments, or, picking biomarkers out of voice, these kinds.
Is that kind of like what Achilles did with ADHD?
Similar, yeah. So Achilles making interventions. Cambridge Cognition is all about measurement, and their games, puzzles, tests are used as the endpoints in clinical trials. So their business model is that they work with pharmaceutical companies. If you're developing a new drug for ADHD, for example, you want to demonstrate that the drug is improving attention, and Cambridge Cognition, their software can do that for you. So they're really all about helping pharmaceutical companies and other therapeutics companies come to market. And I led the science team there. I worked on a couple of hundred of other people's drug development programs, and most of which ultimately failed because neuroscience has not been very successful in terms of getting drugs to market. And we'd often go back and look at why a drug failed or what happened in a particular data set, and see this kind of heterogeneity problem that within any group of patients who were enrolled into a clinical trial for a particular disorder, some would be doing well and some wouldn't. And so we ended up thinking, could we use these biomarkers, which are called CANTAB, this suite of digital biomarkers, could we use them not as the endpoint to say whether a drug was working or not, but as a starting point to say whether a patient has a particular type of brain that we think the drug is going to act on. So this kind of started as a research project. Monument started as a research project within Cambridge Cognition. My COVID project was raising the funding to spin it out as an independent company, and that's what we've been doing for the last sort of 18 months, 2 years now. Is a separate company.
Interesting. So you took this idea of building better digital biomarkers in neuroscience and turned that into a separate company that looks specifically at how do we develop drug and companion pairs.
Exactly, yeah. So we lean on all the development that had already happened within Cambridge Cognition on their biomarkers. And some of these have been used for like 20, 30 years. So loads of really great academic research telling us about what brain networks each biomarker is tapping into, what different drugs do on that biomarker. So a lot of knowledge there. And that's what allows us to find these matches with drugs that suggest that this particular patient group that we can pick up on this particular biomarker might benefit from this particular drug.
And how does that feed into the digital twin trend that's kind of happening?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that. It's a brilliant idea, isn't it? And I think there's so much room for improvement over like traditional clinical trials where going into it, you've got a 50% chance that you're going to be given the placebo and all these kinds of, the kind of patient burden things. So I think it would be a wonderful thing to get involved with. We're very much operating within a regular drug development pathways, so standard preclinical phase 1, phase 2, standard drug trials at the moment. But I think we're starting to see some attitude towards change, and the FDA have just become much more flexible about the use of animal models, which is a great thing if we can reduce that. And I think digital twins and better use of AI in the human part of the drug development process would be also a great advance.
And just taking a couple of steps back, I wanted to learn more about your journey moving from academia into being a CEO, and how you kind of decided to go into industry. What made you change, basically? Because from my understanding, you were doing a postdoc at Cambridge.
That's right. Yeah, I did a little bit of postdoc at Cambridge where I'd done my PhD, and then I actually went to Mass General Hospital in Boston in the States for a year. And so that was sort of the Harvard ecosystem. And it was a great experience. I absolutely loved it. But somewhere in that, my brain switched over and I realized that academia wasn't for me. So when I came back from America, instead of going back into an academic environment, I switched to Cambridge Cognition, this kind of small company, which was a huge change at the time. And I definitely had a slight feeling that it's not so common in the UK, more common in the US, I think, to move into industry from academia. And there's definitely a portion of people that see industry as a second-rate science, which is nonsense, of course. There's brilliant scientists working in industry. But the incentives are different, and industry is really a team game, and academia can be a team game, but often you have to build your own career and promote your own career first. That can be how you get successful.
Like lonely compared to being in a biotech startup.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed my time as a postdoc. I think postdoc's not a particularly lonely time because you maybe haven't had the responsibility yet of having to win grants and manage people and all of that, which is what an academic life turns into. I think it was more that it just suited my personality better to work in a team environment and an environment where the question you were thinking about changed every day, sometimes multiple times a day. I think I have quite a short attention span. I really like new challenges coming at you fast. And particularly when I started at Cambridge Cognition, it was very much a sort of consultancy-based role. So, I'd be thinking about multiple different problems, different areas of disease, different drugs, each day. And that was really exciting. That fast-paced aspect is really exciting, and that's what the attraction is in startup life as well. I sort of became an accidental CEO. I wanted the company to exist, so I ended up having to make it exist in terms of Monument. But the things that I love about it are that there's simultaneously so much going on, and my job is, I always joke that my job is like simultaneously talking to really high level experts, and then talking to people who are maybe high net worth individuals who are interested in the area but know nothing about it, and then like making sure the phone bill gets paid. You know, it's like this strange combination of day-to-day activities. But yeah, I really thrive off that. So it wasn't something I thought I'd ever do, but I'm loving it.
Yeah, I definitely think there's like there's more breadth in like activities you need to do in a startup. But what for you was the most challenging change, moving from quite like a structured environment to a startup, which maybe has less structure? Yeah.
So for us, it happened during COVID, which I guess was just such an odd period of life for everyone, work-wise and not work-wise. So I didn't really have the move from sort of going to an office every day to working in my spare room, or rather I did, but that happened because of COVID. And then by the time COVID had finished, I was working in my spare room for Monument without a boss and without a huge set of colleagues. But the actual environmental change was all mixed in with COVID life changes. So yeah, I'm fine with that. I've always been happy working from home and happy structuring my day, and I love being able to take the dog for a walk and mow the lawn if I'm having an unproductive afternoon, and then finish that PowerPoint presentation in the evening or whatever. So I've always been very happy with that kind of work and life bleeding into each other. I like to work that way, and I like to be in charge of when I'm productive and when I'm not, and all that stuff. I wouldn't go back to an office life for sure. Well, I don't think I would. Life is long, we'll see.
And what are the next steps for Monument?
So we're in a fundraising cycle at the moment. We've done about 18 months of largely preclinical work and our first phase 1 study, all of which has gone incredibly well. I have great colleagues on there.
That's a phase 1 study on the schizophrenia?
That's on the other drug program, which is an anti-neuroinflammation drug. So trying to prevent or treat neuroinflammation. We've essentially taken an anti-inflammatory drug that doesn't normally get into the brain. No anti-inflammatory drugs really get into the brain as far as we know, and worked with some very clever chemists who have reformulated it into a lipid, which allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier, which at least in mice.
The formula of turning that into a lipid?
Yeah, sure. So their formulation work is all proprietary. We have a license for that. But yeah, at least in the preclinical work that we've done in the last year, we're getting the drug into the brain 20 to 50-fold higher. And when it gets into the brain, it has a strong anti-inflammatory effect there. That's all in mice and rats. So we've done the first phase 1 study. It looks very safe, which is very good news. And obviously we can't measure how much is in the brain in quite the same way as we do in animal models, but we can measure spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and we see that we are getting the drug into that. So we believe that we're going to be able to get the drug into the brain of humans in this lipid formulation. And then what will we do with that? Well, loads of interesting brain conditions turn out to have an inflammatory component.
What's like the key indication?
What's my favourite inflammatory indication? So we'd love to go after Alzheimer's disease. We now think that in the cascade of things that happens during Alzheimer's, inflammation in the brain either maybe triggers that or certainly accelerates that. And if you could do something that slowed that down, you might be able to prevent people from developing dementia for a long period of time, and that would be really great. But doing Alzheimer's clinical trials is very big and expensive, so that's not the first place we're going to go. We're actually the first patient group we're going into is a group called post-operative cognitive decline, and this is essentially older adults going in for a surgery, maybe a knee replacement or a hip replacement, really common elective surgeries, and coming out with a permanent cognitive impairment because they get inflammation around the surgical site. So they get an inflammatory response to the surgery, and that crosses into the brain. And it's really common, actually. It's about 15% of people who go in, of older adults who go in for any kind of surgery, are coming out with a permanent cognitive impairment. So, a huge problem. The sort of story, Granny was fine and then she had a hip
how do you filter out the 15% that you need to actually run the study on?
So what we have is a biomarker that detects whether people are high risk or low risk. It's basically detecting whether their brains look really resilient or not going in. And if you have the early signs of anything else, then you should probably either consider not having that surgery, or the goal here with the drug is we would treat it prophylactically. So, you go in a week before surgery to have your ECG done and have swabs taken for COVID and all this kind of thing, do a 15-minute biomarker test, so a game-based test, and out of that it would say, Liv, your brain's absolutely fine, it's very low risk that you'd have a problem, or your brain looks like if you did get some inflammatory problem, this could really put you on the path to a quicker form of dementia or something like that. If so, we'd then treat you with this anti-inflammatory drug so that you have a lower chance of getting that brain inflammation. So that's the model. We're a long way from those patient studies. And as I say, at the moment, we're in a fundraising period. So we're raising a Series A at the moment that will fund our next clinical trials. So most of my life at the moment is about that. Okay. For that and schizophrenia. Okay. So one study for each. And those are sort of proof of mechanism studies. So showing that our biomarkers can find people who will benefit from this kind of drug. So kind of proving the biomarker and the drug together.
Awesome. And if we take it even further, what would be the longer term? What would be the one impact you want to leave on the world with Monument?
Honestly, if I was ever involved in a drug that worked, I would be a happy person. It's, mental illness has impacted my family. I guess it's impacted almost everyone's family. Alzheimer's disease, it's such a big area, and we've made so little progress really compared with how much we've made in things like cancer and cardiovascular disease. So yeah, if I were ever able to help a drug get to market, I'd be a pretty happy person.